Hey folks, welcome to video number 9. This one is a brief overview of the Reconstruction era, the years immediately following the United States Civil War, which wrapped up, at least militarily, in 1865. So let's get going. So what exactly was Reconstruction? What are we talking about when we say the Reconstruction era? Well, we're talking about a period of rebuilding the United States post-Civil War. You can see in the photo to the right the ruins of a southern city. This is probably Richmond, but there were places throughout the South that looked like this. And obviously, the United States, especially in the South, was going to have to physically rebuild, but even in the North, that didn't experience as much physical damage, was going to have to rebuild and re-understand what it meant to be an American. So it generally refers to the end of fighting in 1865 to 12 years later, the withdrawal of soldiers, Union soldiers, from former Confederate states in 1877. And this was the reconstruction of government, this was the reconstruction of society, and reconstruction of the economy. Remember, the South had depended on slavery, and even some northern states had depended on slavery for its economic well-being. Well, at the end of the Civil War, slavery legally did not exist anymore, so their economies had to be rebuilt. And there were very different ideas about what the government and society and what needed to happen in order to rebuild the United States. These ideas would be played out and argued over in government and in society. So let's focus on the politics first. So President Abraham Lincoln had favored a lenient Reconstruction plan that would have allowed readmission of the southern states to the United States pretty quickly. However, President Lincoln was assassinated. And when he was assassinated, a group of Republicans who were in Congress, known as the Radical Republicans, because some of the ideas they had, like equality between whites and blacks, scared a lot of people and many people considered them radical. These radical Republicans, they wanted to punish the South for having left the United States, attempted to leave the United States, and wanted to punish them for having owned slaves and for, in their eyes, having caused the Civil War. They blamed in particular on the slaveholders, and they wanted African Americans to be made full citizens, and they wanted male suffrage, so all African American males should receive the right to vote. So Andrew Johnson became president after Abraham Lincoln's assassination, and he also favored a lenient Reconstruction policy, but with some very important differences. He did not care about protecting the former slaves, about protecting their rights now as citizens of the United States. He also required former Confederate leaders to apply for a presidential pardon. So basically, they had to get a pardon directly from the president. They basically had to go to the White House and beg the president of the United States, who was himself a Southerner from the state of Tennessee. They had to beg him for a pardon. So Andrew Johnson was kind of using this opportunity to please his own ego. Johnson also vetoed various congressional acts that would have supported the former slaves, the 4 million now free African Americans who needed a lot of support in getting a new start on life in this freedom. So here's a cartoon from the era that shows a caricature of Andrew Johnson in the middle, hand in hand with two small children who represent the Civil Rights Act and represent the newly freed African Americans, freed from slavery, and showing how, like in Hansel and Gretel, the father was not actually kind to them. He was going to leave them in the woods. So you should recheck that fairy tale if you thought it was a happy one. So in 1866, the Radical Republicans gained control of Congress and took over Reconstruction from President Johnson. They expanded the Freedmen's Bureau, which was a government group that helped former slaves, as well as poor whites, by providing them with clothing, food, medical care, employment, and, most importantly, education, opening up schools throughout the South for African Americans to actually finally learn how to read and do numbers and get an education that they had craved for so long but had not been able to get. They also passed a Civil Rights Act in 1866. This one granted African American citizenship and made black codes illegal. Black codes were laws that discriminated against African Americans because of their race. There's also the Reconstruction Act of 1867. This one stated that former Confederate states would be occupied by the military. Union troops, American troops, would occupy the cities and the countrysides and make sure that African Americans were protected and make sure that the former Confederate states were obeying the laws of the United States. And the states, the southern states, would have to meet very strict criteria in order to be readmitted. The radical Republicans also attempted to impeach Andrew Johnson. They considered him doing a poor job and not fulfilling the obligations of his office. And he came really close to being impeached, the closest any president has ever come to being impeached. He came within one vote of being removed from office. But by one vote, he was saved and was able to serve out the rest of his term, but he wasn't really able to do anything. So here's a cartoon from the era that shows how the Union Army got between former Confederate soldiers and Southern whites and African Americans. There was a lot of tension in the South, and so the Union Army had to play a defensive role and diffuse some of the tension, or at least try and prevent it from becoming violent. And here's a cartoon that shows you the attitude that people in the South and even the North had towards something like the Freedmen's Bureau. A negative portrayal of African Americans and saying that they were just draining the government, that these former slaves were lazy and not wanting to work, when in fact these African Americans, they wanted to farm, they wanted to succeed, they wanted to support their families and on their own. But again, this was a very popular image of the former slaves at the time. And here's a ticket, an actual ticket to get into the U.S. Senate to watch the impeachment trial for Andrew Johnson. This was a very popular ticket back then, very much in demand. But again, he was not actually impeached. So there are very important changes to the Constitution. Remember, the Constitution had supported slavery with things like the Three-Fifths Compromise, the fugitive slave portion of the Constitution that allowed for runaway slaves to be reclaimed and forced back into slavery, and the compromise that had said the slave trade would not be banned until 1808. So, some very important changes were made to the Constitution in the years following the Civil War. The 13th Amendment, which was ratified in 1865 and ultimately took effect in 1866, this officially ended slavery. The 14th Amendment, added in 1868, it made citizens of all persons born or naturalized in the United States. That meant that all 4 million former slaves who had been born in the United States automatically became citizens. There's no question that they were American citizens. It also granted equal protection of the law, and this is going to become really important in years coming, even today, when people, when groups claim that they are being discriminated against and not receiving equal protection of the law. This basically meant that no state could deprive a person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. This amendment is going to play a big part in a lot of civil rights cases, in racial cases, in cases about sexuality and about gender discrimination. And if you look at most Supreme Court cases today, they are connected in some way to the 14th Amendment. Then you had the 15th Amendment, ratified in 1870, and this protected the right to vote for all men regardless of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. So, simply put, this meant that all men were able to vote. However, there's a pretty big loophole that says that even though you can't be denied the right to vote based on race or former state as a slave, states are going to find some loopholes to prevent African Americans from being able to vote. So here's another cartoon that shows that's a positive portrayal of African Americans. You'll notice Abraham Lincoln in the bottom and families, black families who are thriving under their newly freed state of emancipation. Here's a picture, a very famous drawing, that shows African American men taking advantage of their now constitutionally protected right to vote. Speaking of African Americans during Reconstruction achieved so much in just a 12-year period of time, but it's often overlooked. So we're going to look at this more closely in class as to everything that African Americans achieved, because it often gets disregarded or covered up, or just not mentioned. So the southern population and the physical environment were devastated, and this is where most African Americans lived. You had some free blacks in the South, but most of the African Americans down there had formerly been slaves. So you got over 4 million. Now, now that they were free, they were competing with their former owners and with other whites, particularly poor whites, for limited resources. Many African Americans, though, one of the first things they wanted to do was reunite with their families. If they'd been separated through being sold or if somebody had run away, they attempt to seek out their family members wherever they might have been, which was very difficult since they didn't have good records. You had other African Americans, such as Hiram Revels, who were elected to state and national offices. Hiram Revels was the first African American to serve in the United States Congress. From Mississippi, education, as I mentioned earlier, also became a priority. The Freedmen's Bureau had established schools throughout the South, and in these classes you had grandmothers sitting alongside their grandchildren, learning their letters and learning how to really use math, reading, finally reading the Bible. They had heard all these stories from the Bible for so long, and they finally were learning to read them with their own eyes. The Freedmen's Bureau, again, played a critical role in that. And you even had universities that were established, such as Howard University, were created to educate those African Americans who had been denied an opportunity for a higher level education. Howard University is the second oldest black college in the United States, historically black college. It was founded in 1867. The oldest college, specifically for African Americans, is Lincoln College in Pennsylvania. Many African Americans, well, since they had been slaves, they knew how to work the land. That is what they knew. That is how they wanted to support their families. So many of them became sharecroppers or tenant farmers. What this meant was that they would have to rent their land and rent tools from their former masters. So this created a very interesting situation in the South, where former slaves were now independently working with their masters, but the former masters would try and still control them. And one of the ways they did it was by, overcharging for land or overcharging for tools, making sure that the African Americans were always in debt to them. And in fact, most African American farmers, these sharecroppers and tenant farmers, they rarely ever made enough money to buy their own land and to be independent. Well, here's a picture of Hiram Revels, again, the first African American to serve in Congress from the state of Mississippi. There he is on the far left, along with several other the first African Americans to serve in the United States Senate and in the House of Representatives. Here's a picture of one of the freedmen's schools. You see all those children, but also a few adults or possibly teenagers who, again, were attending these schools. And these schools were packed throughout the South. And a lot of women came from northern states to the South to teach in these schools. Here's the logo for Howard University, founded in 1867. It was named after General O.O. Howard, who was the head of the Freedmen's Bureau. And here's a picture of taken after the Civil War. These are actually sharecroppers who were in the cotton fields picking cotton, just as many of them had done when slavery was allowed. So many things had changed for African Americans, but some things, like hard labor on farms, were still very much the same. So some of the problems that arose during Reconstruction, well, as mentioned before, you had some groups of whites, former slave owners, who were working to limit the freedoms of African Americans during this time period. You had black codes, which I mentioned earlier. These were state and town laws that tried to limit the rights of African Americans, not allowing them to live in certain areas, requiring them to have a job, forcing them to walk in the streets instead of on the sidewalk. A lot of very nitpicky laws that could cause African Americans, law-abiding African Americans, to be accused and charged with committing crimes. Then you had the KKK. The Ku Klux Klan was organized in 1866, and they terrorized and killed African Americans throughout the South. Former Confederate soldiers and even generals and leaders gradually regained political and economic power at the state level, local level, and even at the national level. Northerners, those who lived in the states that had won the Civil War, they actually became less concerned about the fate of former slaves in Reconstruction overall. It was exhausting. This was a very time-consuming and money-consuming task, and they just got tired of dealing with it and all the problems that arose. It was a very difficult time, and they just got tired of dealing with it. They wanted it to end. And the Republican Party, which had led the charge, the party of Lincoln, the party that had the radical Republicans, a under President Ulysses S. Grant in the 1870s, had to deal with a lot of scandals, and this wore them out. This caused a lot of distractions. So people turned away from Reconstruction and the issues in the southern and former slave states to focus on these other scandals. And again, it wore people out. The Supreme Court also made several rulings about some of the laws passed by Congress that allowed states to restrict rights of African Americans. Basically, it said that laws that segregated and discriminated against African Americans were constitutional. And that's something we're going to look at continuously throughout this class. And here's a cartoon, again, showing how certain groups like the KKK and other groups like the White League would work together to limit the opportunities and the lives of African Americans. So Reconstruction finally came to an end as part of the presidential election of 1876. Democratic candidate Samuel Tilden was one vote shy of winning the Electoral College, so therefore one vote shy of becoming president. So supporters of Republican candidate Rutherford B. Hayes worked out a deal with the Democrats, and this deal was that Hayes would get enough votes to win the Electoral College and the presidency. And in return, Hayes, as president, would withdraw all remaining troops in the former Confederate states. And this effectively ended Reconstruction because those soldiers were not in those former Confederate states to enforce the law and to protect the rights and the bodies of African Americans. So this led to southern states basically running their own affairs without constant federal intervention. And so many of the accomplishments of African Americans at the state and local level, and even at the national level, quickly disappeared and were forgotten. The Redeemers, as a lot of these whites, former Confederates who seized power, these Redeemers, as they were known, quickly tried to erase the accomplishments of African Americans, make people forget that they'd even accomplished anything. Still, we can't forget this because the constitutional amendments, the establishment of black colleges like Howard University, organizations that arose out of the Freedmen's Bureau, they all played critical roles in the fight for civil rights. And as soon as African Americans gained their freedom, even before they were free from slavery, they were fighting for their rights, fighting for civil rights. And this is a fight that they're going to continue even to the present day. And we'll keep talking about that in class and throughout the year. So thanks for watching. Be sure to stay tuned for video 10. We're going to start looking at America as it began to move west and also as it began to industrialize.